This time last Friday, I suppose it was just about beginning to be in progress. It was the coup attempt over in Istanbul and Ankara, which has led to something like 7,000 arrests now. President Erdogan much more firmly in power now.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about this week to try and work out what's been
give us your breakdown on it all.
Well, the centre of the coup was clearly Incirlik Air Base, which is the NATO air base, where the US is mostly it's a Turkish air base, but it's a bit like RAF Fairford. It's not really controlled by the Turks.
It's a US air base, which is used for airstrikes. It's been there for decades, hasn't it?
It wasn't
in the Middle East.
It wasn't allowed to be used in the 1991 Gulf War or in the 2003 Gulf War because the Turkish government both times said, "Look, you can't use that air base for that." What the real political significance, whatever the actual detail of the coup, and there's still stuff coming out about this, is it shows a break between Turkey and the Western powers, particularly the US. The Turks last week basically Erdogan apologised to Putin for shooting down his plane in Syria, and now the guys that actually shot the plane down have been arrested as part of the coup faction. Okay? So Erdogan's arrested those people, the pilots that actually shot down. So he's basically saying, I didn't want that to happen, somebody made it happen, and now we're punishing those responsible. And he's going to be meeting with Putin very shortly. Now, it could well be, and that's where my money is, that this was an attempt by elements within the Turkish military, which are linked to the British and the Americans, to remove Erdogan, because he was about to change sides. He's about to go and negotiate with Putin.
Well, okay, let's look at the context of it. That's what I think is the meat of this. The context of all of this is that the Turks, as part of NATO, shot down that Russian plane, didn't they? A Russian jet. And literally just about 2 weeks ago now, there was a fulsome apology, apparently, from Erdogan saying, we're very sorry that happened. We won't make sure it won't happen again. And there's certainly some sort of rapprochement was going on between
also
Turkey and Russia.
The other thing was reported in The Guardian, but hardly anywhere else in the Western media, they're also saying we're going to have to deal with Assad. Yeah, we've given up trying to overthrow him. Now that's when Erdogan is a loose cannon, to put it mildly, and he's now come to the conclusion that everything he's been doing for the last few years is all wrong. It's about time to make peace with the Russians and make peace with Damascus. Now at that point, the military intervene, although not successfully. Which then, of course, this is of great geopolitical importance here. Turkey is a very, very important country in terms of international politics.
I noticed at one point last Saturday, I think it was, I read a report saying that the Incirlik Air Base had been surrounded by Turkish soldiers, and all their electricity was cut off. So this is one of the main US air bases in NATO, cut off by its domestic individuals there, so they had no power either.
There were 50 US nuclear warheads on the airbase, and Erdogan was in a position to take them over and say, we're now a nuclear power, we've got 50 warheads. That's how crazy it all is.
Well, what about the mass arrests and the taking down civil liberties? Because one of the things he's been talking about, Martin, one of the things he's been talking about is actually reintroducing the death penalty retrospectively, if you could believe that.
Yep, because don't forget it was
when you did it, it was okay. It was an imprisonable offence, but I'm going to change the law and say that when you did it, actually now I can hang you.
Well, it's sending a signal, isn't it? Don't forget that the Turkish military have tried to overthrow the democratic government of Turkey and succeeded on many occasions in the past. In 1962, in the 1950s, in the 1990s, in 1980, they were the first country in the world to impose IMF structural adjustment when the social democratic government of East Turkey was kicked out by the military. And that military, that Turkish military, is armed and trained by NATO. That means their chaps are trained at Sandhurst. Many people in the street in Turkey, now listen to this, people listening to this show, they think that we, the British, were behind the coup. And you may say, well, we're not behind the coup. What's it got to do with us? I say, Turkey's part of NATO. We run NATO. The British and the Americans run NATO. Many people in Turkey are absolutely convinced that we were behind the coup. And we were definitely behind the coup in 1980 and the coup attempt in the 1990s. And eventually, of course, a lot of top generals in Turkey were sent to prison for life for carrying out false flag terrorist attacks. They were bombing things, shooting things, pretending to be left-wingers, pretending to be right-wingers, pretending to be Islamists, but in actual fact it it was the MIT, the Turkish intelligence services. They've been caught red-handed by their own police force supplying weaponry to ISIS. All of these things are true, and Turkey is an integral part of NATO. So all the evil things that have been happening in Turkey, inside the military and inside the intelligence structure, the deep state, Ergonokon, that is the responsibility of the Americans and the British in particular. So we are held responsible. And when people in Britain say, well, why do they hate us? Well, what you say is, well, we've imposed military governments on them 5 times in the last 50 years and killed hundreds of thousands of their people. Would they hate us for that? I think I might if I was Turkish or Kurdish. What would you think, Tony?
What about the Israelis? Do you think they were involved as well?
Any evidence
of that?
Yep. Because everybody, if Erdogan was genuinely thinking of changing his tack and deciding he was going to cozy up to the Russians and give up on overthrowing Assad, lots of people in the West would have been very unhappy about that, and that includes within his own military.
And why has Erdogan been closing down newspapers, closing down political and election polling organisations, and basically kicking journalists out of the country, and it's even imprisoning some that he doesn't agree with? Well, if he's got any real interest in having a modern democracy, he's not, is he? He's a dictator.
Well, he's no more or less of a dictator than Mohamed Morsi in Egypt. And in actual fact, the Egyptian military government were very keen for this coup to succeed because they don't like Erdogan. Now, the fact of it is that Erdogan is an authoritarian populist. He has mass support. There is no doubt about it. And some people compare him to Putin. I think that's wrong. Erdogan is a much nastier piece of work than Putin. Putin has checks and balances. Erdogan has none. But don't forget that Turkey is a very fragile state because 20 million people, a substantial section of the population, are Kurdish, the people that live in the southeast of the country, and they don't want to be part of the state at all. And, of course, there's a real possibility here that the state could break up. And, of course, we've been backing the Turkish military in their war against the people of Turkish Kurdistan over 20 or 30 years. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Even in the last year, hundreds and hundreds of civilians have been killed in cold blood by the Turkish military. And that Turkish military is part of NATO. So those people on the receiving end, they blame us. They blame Britain. They blame the Americans. And when people say, oh, well, what have we ever done to hurt these people? Say, everything. You've done everything to hurt these people. If they hit back at you, can you cry?
I've seen a couple of articles pointing the fingers at Erdogan, saying, "Well, look, this is his Reichstag fire. Maybe he was involved in creating this because it's given him a fantastic excuse to arrest and jail all his political opponents."
I've seen that suggestion. I would suggest that's a bit.
I mean, the actual comparison is with the big bomb that blew off the side of the Parliament building last Friday night.
The Turkish military have always engaged in false flag operations because they're part of NATO, and they were even more enthusiastic about false flag operations than the Italians or the Belgians. Everybody in Turkey knows that the deep state, the Ergonokon state, which was exposed when a car crashed, which had a top drug dealer and a top general in it and was stuffed with weaponry and information in the 1990s. And in the past, the military have used false flag terrorism, including bombing things, shooting people, killing people, in order to try and prevent Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, from coming to power. Now, the Justice and Development Party is a legitimate political force, but it's true in life in general. You can have legitimate political forces who represent ordinary people who behave in an authoritarian way, and especially, of course, when people feel threatened. Don't forget, hundreds of people were killed in this military coup. It wasn't a bloodless military coup. Lots of people lost their lives. The army killed people. That's bound to make people a bit angry. And I think what Erdogan is doing is he's using the occasion of the coup to try and obtain total control. But it's very interesting that the HDP, which is the Kurdish party in the parliament, which is very hostile to Erdogan, they're at daggers drawn, he's about to threaten to lock them all up and all the rest of it, they came out immediately in support of, not of him, but of Turkish democracy, as did the Iranians, and I believe the Syrians. And the Russians also came out in support of Erdogan. And I do not...
So I heard John Kerry last Friday night saying that democracy must be upheld, etc.
Well, that's right. That's what everybody says. But then the cynics in the street in Turkey will say, well, the Americans say that. Oh, that's what the State Department always says.
Do you have any evidence do you have any evidence that this was organised from the US Air Base Incirlik?
Yep, that's what Erdogan himself is saying. That's why they closed it down.
What about this Gulen movement in the US?
Well, he's very close to the CIA. He's based in the US. He owns loads of charter schools in the US. He's a multimillionaire. He's a multimillionaire, moderate Islamist businessman, supposedly moderate, but his people and Erdogan's people have been very involved in the creation of jihadist groups right across the Middle East, right across Central Asia, and even as far as Xinjiang.
It sounds like a bit like a Turkish version of Bin Laden and his Wahhabism.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, the point is that Gladio, Sybil Edmonds, the former FBI translator, is Turkish, has just written a novel about Gladio. You've got to realise that the Turks, in particular, and the Turkish military, have been intimately involved in false flag terrorism across them. I mean, they've been supplying. The Russians have given chapter and verse to the UN about the Turkish military supplying weaponry and arms to Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. Also, and they are part of NATO. Also, it's not as if the British don't know about this. The British have been there helping them. And then people say, where did these jihadis come from? Well, ask MI6. They've been training them for years.
Also, it was quite interesting, at 10 o'clock on... they obviously had the article all ready to go. On last Friday night, the BBC published an article called, with the headline, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's ruthless president. According to the Istanbul governor, the military coup has been suppressed. The commander of Istanbul's 3rd Corps reportedly issued a televised order for all troops to return to barracks. Now, this is a really scathing article published by the BBC, really just as the coup was being announced.
So, in other words, shock, horror, the BBC are being used as part of a coup attempt in Turkey. The Western powers were very quiet until it was clear that the coup had failed, and then they came out and condemned it. People who are the supporters of Erdogan, and not just the supporters of Erdogan, I'm quite sure that the HDP and Kurdish radical forces like the PKK will be very cynical about what's happened here. Because don't forget, this has happened in Turkey in the past.
They've had quite a few coups, haven't they?
Umpteen military coups in Turkey, all organised from Washington and London. And people say, well, that's nothing to do with us. Yes, it is. It always was. It still is. And then you say, well, why are all these refugees coming? Because you started these wars. You said you wanted them, now you've got them.
Another indication the US were involved is the Federal Aviation Administration last Friday night and Saturday banned all Turkish airlines from flying to the US.
The way the Americans do coups is they have the State Department condemning the coup, meanwhile the CIA are actually running the coup. So that the State Department can have plausible deniability. Oh, well, it's just an internal matter in Turkey, we'll have to adapt to it. But nevertheless, they can still be behind it. I'm quite sure that the elements within the Turkish military who thought they could get away with the coup also thought that they would get a wink and a nod from the NATO powers. That includes Theresa May, Boris Johnson and others. Of course, it hasn't worked, and now there's a hell of a mess to clean up, isn't there?
Just to recap on last week's horrific attack in Nice, I noticed last night an article which is the French Interior Ministry ordering the mayor's office in Nice to destroy all CCTV images and pictures from the event.
Now, why would they want to do something like that if they wanted to get to the truth of the event? The fact is, folks, who listen to this show week in, week out, you will know that more often than not, terrorist events are being orchestrated by somebody's intelligence services. Virtually all of them. There are hardly any events which haven't got some intelligence fingerprint in them. And
I noticed, of course, that he was being followed by the FBI, that guy. I mean, he was the local French intelligence services and police had never come across him before, but the FBI were following him very closely.
Well, it now turns out that he's supposedly got accomplices. And
Well, they've just arrested all of his friends and they've turned them into his accomplices.
Yeah, so turned them into his accomplices. But Rita Katz's website,
Search for International Terrorist Entities, yeah.
They were the ones that put up the so-called ISIS claim of this. Now, they of course, are Mossad and CIA linked. That all of the people find it hard to believe that the intelligence services in the Western world would carry out such an evil attack in order to create fear and tension and in order to bring in martial law and all the rest of it. Nobody in Turkey has any delusions that NATO is anything other than a full-on terrorist organisation. Nobody, whatever political side of the political spectrum they come from. People in the West are naive about what goes on. They simply are.
BC